The Somali fraud problem in Minnesota is not confined to child care centers. Federal prosecutors in Minnesota expect that half of the more than $18 billion spent since 2018 on 14 different Minnesota welfare programs may prove to be fraudulent. To put that figure into perspective, the amount of fraud, if confirmed, may approach the entire GDP of the nation of Somalia. Mr. Hagan.
Welcome back, everyone. What you are about to see is a textbook example of what happens when progressive policies collision course with reality. We are looking at a crucial Senate hearing addressing a massive, rampant welfare fraud crisis in Minnesota, one that has effectively turned the state's public assistance infrastructure into an unmonitored slush fund. For years, conservatives have warned that combining open border philosophies with a massive, unchecked welfare state is an absolute recipe for disaster. This isn't just about administrative errors. We are talking about blatant, systemic exploitation where hundreds of millions of your hard-earned taxpayer dollars are reportedly being funneled directly out of American communities and sent overseas to corrupt jurisdictions. When confronted with cold, hard data, the response from progressive apologists isn't accountability, it's deflection. They want you to look the other way while the public trust is completely hollowed out. Senator Ted Cruz steps up to the microphone to expose this exact pattern, pinning down the exact cost of this breakdown in basic government oversight. Pay close attention to how the witnesses handle a direct, binary question about whether this dynamic actually serves the national interest. If you want honest conservative analysis without the mainstream media spin, subscribe and turn on notifications right now. Let's roll the tape.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I think it is amazing that Democrats never seem to focus on innocent victims who are shot and killed by illegal aliens that their policies have led into this country. They never seem to say names like Jocelyn Nungary in my hometown of Houston, who was raped and murdered, a young girl, by two Venezuelan gang members that Joe Biden had in custody and released, and they came to Houston and raped and murdered that beautiful little girl. They never seem to mention someone like Laken Riley, a nursing student, beautiful young woman, murdered by an illegal alien the Democrats have released. They never seem to mention anyone like Kate Steinle, a beautiful young woman, 28 years old, in California, shot on a pier by an illegal alien who had been released over and over and over again. We have had Kate Steinle's father testify before this committee. He held her head in his hands as she died, and her last words were, "Help me, Daddy." And yet, for my Democrat colleagues, it seems there's no limit to how many Americans can be murdered by illegal aliens, and yet they simply don't care. They still support open borders and releasing murderers and releasing violent criminals. We're here today because of the Democrats' open border policies and the damage it's done to this country. But we're also here today because Minnesota's welfare system has been treated like an open ATM, and the taxpayers are the ones getting robbed. Ms. Gambler, GAO has reported that the federal government loses hundreds of billions of dollars each year to fraud and improper payments, much of it in public benefit programs. Is that correct?
Yes, GAO has reported both on estimates of federal government losses due to fraud, as well as estimates of improper payments government-wide.
You may recall the infamous Leering Center, whose blacked-out windows and childless facilities have become emblematic of the public programs fraud currently plaguing Minnesota. Mr. O'Brien, when investigators encounter fraud this obvious, does it usually represent just a single isolated bad actor or the visible tip of a much larger scheme?
No, it's usually the visible tip of a much larger scheme. Fraud has a tendency not to occur in a vacuum.
In that instance, the fraud was so blatant that the owners of the business couldn't be bothered to spell the organization's name correctly on the public signage. Mr. O'Brien, does fraud of that magnitude typically persist because it's difficult to detect, or because oversight and enforcement break down?
It tends to persist because oversight and enforcement break down, and it tends to spread geometrically.
The Somali fraud problem in Minnesota is not confined to child care centers. Federal prosecutors in Minnesota expect that half of the more than $18 billion spent since 2018 on 14 different Minnesota welfare programs may prove to be fraudulent. To put that figure into perspective, the amount of fraud, if confirmed, may approach the entire GDP of the nation of Somalia. Mr. Hankinson, once funds are laundered and sent overseas to fragile or corrupt jurisdictions, is there any realistic prospect of recovering them?
Only if they come back and spend them.
Folks, that right there is the absolute state of Washington oversight, and it tells you everything you need to know about the current political divide. Let's break down what just happened, because this exchange exposes a fundamental flaw in how the radical left views governance, spending, and accountability. Senator Ted Cruz started this out by setting a powerful, somber stage. He brought up names that the mainstream media constantly tries to sweep under the rug: Jocelyn Nungarai, Laken Riley, Kate Steinle. Why does he lead with that? Because it establishes the real-world human cost of open border policies. It sets a baseline of what happens when the government fails its most basic constitutional duty, protecting its citizens. But then, Cruz shifted the spotlight directly onto the fiscal nightmare happening in Minnesota. Think about the phrase he used: the welfare system has been treated like an open ATM. It's an incredibly accurate image. We are looking at a situation where investigators found fraud so incredibly blatant that the business owners couldn't even bother to spell their own organization's name correctly on the public signage. And how does a multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme like that survive and spread? As the testimony explicitly confirmed, it happens because oversight and enforcement completely break down. Let's talk numbers, because the statistics Cruz brought forward are absolutely staggering. He noted that federal prosecutors expect up to half of the $18 billion spent on 14 different Minnesota welfare programs since 2018 may prove to be completely fraudulent. Think about that for a second. $9 billion. Cruz pointed out that this amount approaches the entire GDP of the nation of Somalia. How can anyone look at those metrics and claim the system is working? But the real gotcha moment, the climax that should infuriate every single taxpayer watching, was when Cruz put a beautifully simple question to the panel. Is importing vast numbers of people from an impoverished nation, putting the majority of them on public welfare for years and decades at a time, and then turning a blind eye while they steal billions of taxpayer dollars, is that helping America or hurting America? Look at the frantic tap dancing that followed. Ms. Gambler immediately retreated into pure, unadulterated bureaucratic jargon, talking about GAO frameworks and practices for managing risk. It's the classic deep state response. When caught in a failure, talk about the process instead of the results. Then you have Mr. Schwartz, who actually attempted to argue that the net economic benefit of this population far outweighs the cost. Cruz rightfully cut straight through that nonsense. If a system allows $9 billion to be stolen from the taxpayers of Minnesota, how on earth can you claim there is a net benefit? You cannot separate the massive welfare dependency from the fraud. They are symptoms of the same disease. When pushed to the wall, what did the progressive witness do? He tried to deflect by blaming the Trump administration for decimating the U.S. Attorney's Office. It's an incredibly weak, predictable pivot. The fraud happened on a massive scale due to local and state structural breakdowns, yet the knee-jerk reaction is always to point the finger at Donald Trump. Cruz landed the final definitive blow before his time expired, exposing the quiet part out loud. Why do our colleagues across the aisle tolerate this level of waste, dependency, and broken security? Because to them, building a dependent, reliable voting bloc is worth the trade-off. They are perfectly content letting the American taxpayer foot the bill as long as it consolidates their political power. This hearing is a stark reminder that our civic culture relies on a respect for the public commons. When that kindness is exploited, it must be confronted, not excused. What do you think? Did Cruz successfully corner the panel, or did the witnesses manage to skate by? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.